Commander Vex-High stood before the massive viewing screen of the Zephyrian Dreadnought times Stellar Dominance ***. The ship was 3 kilometers long, and armed with enough plasma cannons to glass a small moon. Around them, the Kepler Nebula sparkled with the light of distant stars. But Vex-High's attention was focused on the tactical display showing enemy positions. The rebellion had been growing for months now. Several outer colonies had declared independence from the Zephyrian Empire, thinking they could somehow stand against the most powerful military force in the galaxy. It was laughable, really. The Zephyrians had conquered 47 star systems in the last century alone. Their technology was advanced beyond most species' comprehension. Their soldiers were trained from birth, and their ships could withstand direct hits from stellar-class weapons. "Commander," called out Navigation Officer Keftel from his station, "we're receiving updated intelligence reports on the rebel forces." Vex-High's 4 arms moved smoothly across the control interface, calling up the data. The familiar blue glow of the holographic display showed fleet compositions, weapon capabilities, and battle formations. Everything looked exactly as expected. The rebels had managed to scrape together maybe 50 ships, mostly outdated cruisers and converted cargo vessels. Their total firepower wouldn't even dent the shields of a single Zephyrian battleship. But then something caught Vex-High's attention. A new entry in the intelligence files, marked with yellow warning indicators. "What is this reference to, human vessels?" Vex-High asked, manipulating the display to bring up the relevant section. Tactical analyst Quindar looked up from her workstation. "A new species, Commander. They appeared in this sector about 6 months ago. Intelligence suggests they only achieved faster than light travel recently. Very primitive by galactic standards." Vex-High examined the data more closely. The file contained grainy images of what appeared to be small, bipedal creatures. No natural armor, no visible weapons, soft skin that would tear easily. Their ships looked equally pathetic, crude metal constructions with no energy shielding, using what appeared to be chemical propulsion for maneuvering. "How many ships do they have in the area?" Vex-High asked. "Reports suggest maybe a dozen vessels, all small to medium class. They seem to have allied themselves with the rebellion, though we're not sure why anyone would want their help." Vex-High's mandibles clicked in what passed for laughter among his species. Humans. They looked like the kind of species that would normally be conquered within a few days of first contact. Soft, weak, with technology that belonged in a museum. The fact that they had somehow achieved interstellar travel was probably just luck. The tactical display updated again, showing the latest position reports. The rebel fleet was massing near the asteroid field designated Sector 7 Gamma. It was a clever choice, actually. The asteroids would provide cover and make it difficult for larger ships to maneuver effectively. But the rebels had made one crucial mistake. They had chosen to make their stand in a location where the Zephyrians could use their numerical superiority. "Signal the fleet," Vex-High ordered. "All ships are to move to attack formation Delta 7. We'll approach from 3 vectors simultaneously and crush them before they can scatter." "Yes, Commander." "Admiral Thex-Moore is requesting permission to begin the assault." "Granted, but tell the Admiral to be careful not to destroy everything too quickly. Command wants some of their ships intact for study, particularly these human vessels. It might be amusing to see what passes for technology among such a primitive species." Around them, the time's stellar dominance times began to turn toward the battlefield. Through the viewing ports, Vex-High could see the other ships of the Zephyrian First Fleet moving into position. 12 dreadnoughts, 30 battleships, and over 100 smaller vessels. The rebels were outnumbered at least 3 to 1. And that wasn't counting the massive technological advantage the Zephyrians possessed. The communications officer activated the fleet-wide channel, and Admiral Thex-Moore's voice filled the bridge. "All ships. This is Admiral Thex-Moore. We are approaching the rebel position. Remember, we want this to be a clean operation. Disable their ships where possible, destroy them where necessary. Intelligence indicates the presence of some new alien species calling themselves humans, but they pose no additional threat. Probably just scavengers looking to profit from the chaos." Vex-High nodded approvingly. The Admiral was right to be confident. The Zephyrians had fought dozens of species over the years, and the pattern was always the same. Initial resistance, followed by quick capitulation once the aliens realized they were completely outmatched. Some species fought bravely, others surrendered immediately. But the end result was always Zephyrian victory. The tactical display showed energy signatures beginning to spike throughout the rebel fleet. They were powering up their weapons and shields, preparing for the fight they knew was coming. Vex-High had to admire their courage, even if it was pointless. "Commander," Quindar reported, "we're detecting unusual energy patterns from some of the rebel ships. The signatures don't match any known technology." "Show me." The display highlighted several vessels within the rebel formation. They were smaller than most of the other ships, with angular, utilitarian designs that looked more like industrial equipment than military vessels. But the energy readings were strange. Lots of electromagnetic radiation and what appeared to be primitive atomic reactions. "Nuclear fission," Quindar said with obvious disbelief. "Commander, these ships are powered by nuclear fission reactors. I haven't seen technology that primitive since my academy courses on pre-spaceflight civilizations." Vex-High stared at the display. Nuclear fission. The humans were using technology that most species had abandoned thousands of years ago. Shortly after developing fusion power, it was like watching someone try to fight with stone knives against plasma rifles. How exactly did such a primitive species manage to achieve faster-than-light travel? Vex-High wondered aloud. "Unknown, Commander. Perhaps they stole the technology. Or maybe they found some ancient ruins. It hardly matters now." The fleet continued its approach. According to the battle plan, they would reach optimal firing range in approximately 12 minutes. The rebels seemed to be holding their position, probably hoping the asteroid field would give them some tactical advantage. It wouldn't. The Zephyrians had fought in asteroid fields before, and they had weapons specifically designed for such environments. Vex-High settled back in the command chair and prepared to watch another routine victory. By this time tomorrow, the rebellion would be crushed. And these humans would either be dead or prisoners. Either way, they would serve as an example to any other primitive species that might consider opposing the Zephyrian Empire. The tactical display began counting down to weapons range, and Vex-High allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. This was going to be easy. The first sign that something was wrong came when the human ships dropped out of hyperspace. Vex-High had expected them to arrive with the main rebel fleet, probably hiding behind the larger vessels like the scavengers they appeared to be. Instead, they came from an entirely different vector, appearing suddenly on the edge of the asteroid field like ghosts materializing from the void. "Commander," Navigation Officer Keftel called out, his voice carrying a note of confusion. "We have multiple hyperspace signatures appearing on our port flank. 12 vessels, all showing human energy signatures." Vex-High turned to look at the tactical display. The human ships had appeared in what any competent military strategist would recognize as a terrible position. They were isolated from the main rebel fleet, outnumbered, and positioned between two asteroid clusters that would limit their escape routes. Either they were incredibly stupid, or, are they trying to surrender already? Admiral Thexmore's voice came over the communications channel. It would save us all some time, but the humans weren't broadcasting surrender signals. Instead, they were accelerating directly toward the Zephyrian fleet, their primitive nuclear engines glowing bright against the darkness of space. As they got closer, Vex-High got his first clear look at their vessels. The intelligence reports hadn't done justice to just how primitive these ships really were. They looked like they had been built in some kind of industrial factory. All angles and exposed metal plating. There were no graceful curves, no energy shielding visible along their hulls, and their weapons appeared to be simple projectile launchers. One of the ships looked like it had been damaged and repaired multiple times, with mismatched hull plating and what appeared to be crude welding along several seams. "Target the human vessels," Admiral Thexmore ordered. "Let's get this over with quickly." The Zephyrian ships began to rotate, bringing their main weapons to bear on the approaching humans. Plasma cannons that could melt through a kilometer of solid rock powered up, their energy signatures creating brilliant points of light throughout the fleet. This was going to be a very short fight. But then the human ships did something unexpected. Instead of maintaining their heading or trying to evade the incoming weapons fire, they suddenly broke formation in all directions, not in any pattern that Vexhai recognized, but in what looked like complete chaos. Ships scattered in directions that made no tactical sense, some diving toward the asteroids, others climbing away from the orbital plane. "What are they doing?" Quindar muttered from her station. The Zephyrian weapons fired, sending streams of superheated plasma toward where the human ships had been moments before. But they weren't there anymore. The chaotic scatter pattern had somehow managed to avoid most of the incoming fire, and the few shots that did connect splashed harmlessly against the asteroids. "Lucky," Admiral Thexmore's voice carried obvious annoyance. "All ships maintain fire. They can't dodge forever." But as Vexhai watched the tactical display, he began to realize that luck might not be the right word. The human ships were moving through the asteroid field with a precision that seemed impossible for such primitive vessels. They were using the rocks as cover, but not in any way that followed standard galactic warfare doctrine. Instead of hiding behind the asteroids, they were ricocheting off them, using the gravitational fields and physical contact to change direction in ways that should have torn their ships apart. "Commander," the weapons officer reported, "the humans are not responding to our targeting systems as expected. Their ships appear to be more maneuverable than our computers predicted." One of the human vessels suddenly accelerated directly toward a Zephyrian destroyer, ignoring the plasma fire that was tearing chunks out of its hull. For a moment, Vexhai thought the humans were attempting some kind of suicide attack. But at the last second, the ship rolled and fired what appeared to be a spread of physical projectiles. The projectiles struck the destroyer's shields and detonated in a series of bright flashes. Vexhai expected to see the explosions dissipate harmlessly against the energy barrier. But instead, something strange happened. The shield flickered and failed in several sections, leaving parts of the destroyer's hull exposed. "How did they do that?" Quindar asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "Our shields are designed to stop much more powerful weapons than those primitive explosives." Vexhai studied the sensor readings more carefully. The human projectiles weren't just simple explosives. They were some kind of electromagnetic pulse weapons, designed specifically to disrupt energy fields. It was crude technology, but it was being used in a way that exploited a weakness in Zephyrian shield design that most species had never even discovered. The damaged destroyer began to turn away from the battle, but the human ship wasn't finished with it. Instead of moving on to another target, it continued to pursue, firing more projectiles and what appeared to be some kind of guided missiles. The destroyer's remaining shields were taking a beating, and its return fire was becoming increasingly erratic. Then something happened that made Vexhai's mandibles click in shock. Another human ship, one that had been engaged with a different Zephyrian vessel entirely, suddenly broke off from its own fight and moved to support the first human ship. But it didn't just provide covering fire or attempt to distract the destroyer. Instead, it positioned itself directly in the path of the destroyer's plasma cannons and began to absorb the incoming fire on its own shields. "They're sacrificing their own ship to protect another one," Keftel observed. "That doesn't make any tactical sense." But Vexhai was beginning to suspect that the humans might be operating according to different tactical principles entirely. The ship that was absorbing the fire wasn't trying to survive the encounter. It was trying to buy time for its companion to finish off the destroyer. And it was working. The first human ship continued its attack, systematically destroying the destroyer's weapon systems, while its companion absorbed the return fire. When the second ship's shields finally failed, and its hull began to buckle under the plasma bombardment, its crew did something that Vexhai had never seen before in decades of military service. They detonated their own ship's reactor. The explosion was massive, sending debris and radiation in all directions. The destroyer, caught at close range, suffered critical damage to its engine systems and began to drift helplessly through space. But the tactical implications of what had just happened were far more disturbing than the loss of a single ship. The humans had deliberately sacrificed one of their vessels to disable a much larger enemy ship. Not as a last resort, not because they were out of options, but as a planned tactical maneuver. They had turned their own death into a weapon. "Admiral," Vex High opened a communications channel to the fleet commander. "I believe we may have underestimated these humans." "Noted, Commander. All ships, increase firepower." "These primitives are more cunning than anticipated, but they're still just using crude weapons and suicide tactics. Focus fire and end this quickly." But as Vex High continued to watch the battle unfold, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important. The humans were fighting like no species he had ever encountered before. They weren't trying to win in any conventional sense. They were trying to cause as much damage as possible, regardless of their own losses. And somehow, against all logic and tactical doctrine, it was working. The battle had been raging for 2 hours when Vex High witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he knew about warfare. The Zephyrian cruiser Times Swift Victory Times had successfully boarded one of the human vessels. It should have been over within minutes. Zephyrian soldiers were trained in zero-gravity combat, equipped with personal energy shields, and armed with weapons that could cut through most known materials. The humans, according to all intelligence reports, were soft-bodied creatures, with no natural armor and primitive kinetic weapons. But the boarding action wasn't going according to plan. "Commander," Communications Officer Yelthara reported, "we're receiving distress calls from the boarding teams on the human vessel Times Determination *. They're requesting immediate backup." Vex High frowned. A full squad of Zephyrian soldiers requesting backup to deal with a handful of primitive aliens? "Put me through to squad leader Mordain." The channel crackled with static and background noise that sounded like weapons fire and something else. A strange whistling sound that Vex High couldn't identify. "Commander." Mordain's voice was strained. "These humans are not fighting like any species we've encountered before. They've breached their own hull in multiple locations." "They've what?" "They deliberately destroyed their own life support systems, Commander. The entire ship is venting atmosphere, but they're still fighting. They're using the escaping air as a weapon, trying to blow us out into space. And they're fighting effectively in full vacuum." Vex High stared at the tactical display showing the boarding action. No species fought in hard vacuum by choice. Even with environmental suits, the conditions were too harsh, too disorienting. Most civilized beings would surrender rather than subject themselves to such conditions. "Can't your suits handle vacuum operations, squad leader?" "That's not the problem, Commander. The problem is that the humans don't seem to care that they're in vacuum. Half of them aren't even wearing full environmental protection. They've got on these crude suits that barely cover their bodies, and they're moving around like they're in normal atmosphere." Through the communications link, Vex High could hear the distinctive sound of Zephyrian plasma weapons firing, followed by impacts and what sounded like human voices shouting in their alien language. But instead of the screams of pain or calls for retreat he would expect from any rational species, the human voices sounded almost excited. "Squad leader, what's your current status?" "We're pinned down in what appears to be their engine room. The humans have turned off all artificial gravity, and they're using it as a tactical advantage. They're throwing pieces of their own ship at us, Commander. Actual pieces of metal and debris, using them like projectiles in the zero-gravity environment." Vex High's mandibles clicked in confusion. Using debris as weapons was something that might work in theory, but no trained military force would resort to such primitive tactics unless they were completely out of ammunition and facing certain death. "Are they out of proper weapons?" "No, Commander. They still have their kinetic weapons and some kind of explosive devices, but they're using everything available as a weapon. One of my soldiers was knocked unconscious by a piece of pipe that a human threw at him. They're treating their own ship like a weapons cache." On the main tactical display, Vex High watched as another boarding action began on a different human ship. The Zephyrian assault team cut through the hull and entered what appeared to be the command section. For a few minutes, everything proceeded normally. Then the human ship suddenly began to rotate rapidly on its axis. "What are they doing now?" Admiral Thexmore's voice came over the fleet channel. Tactical analyst Quindar consulted her readings. "The humans appear to be using their ship's rotation to create artificial gravity inside their vessel, but only in specific sections. They're creating areas where the boarding teams are pinned against the walls by centrifugal force, while other areas remain in zero gravity. That's impossible. You can't selectively apply rotational forces like that without destroying your own ship's structural integrity." But apparently, the humans could. The boarding team reported that the humans had somehow reinforced certain sections of their ship while deliberately weakening others, creating a maze-like environment where gravity changed from one corridor to the next. Zephyrian soldiers, trained for consistent environmental conditions, were finding it impossible to maintain their tactical formations. Then the reports from the first boarding action took an even stranger turn. "Commander," Mordane's voice was now barely audible over the background chaos. "The humans have sealed themselves into the remaining sections of their ship, and they're flooding those areas with some kind of gas. Poison gas? Unknown. Our suits are protecting us. But the humans aren't wearing protection. They're deliberately exposing themselves to whatever they've released." Vexhai felt a chill run through his nervous system. No species would voluntarily expose themselves to toxic gases unless they were already dying. But the human voices could still be heard over the communications link. And they didn't sound like creatures in their death throes. "Squad leader, are you certain they're not wearing protection?" "Round 7. Confirmed, Commander. Some of them have these crude cloth masks over their faces, but nothing that would stop a real chemical weapon. But they're still fighting. If anything, they seem more aggressive than before." It took several minutes for the tactical computers to analyze the composition of the gas the humans had released. When the results came back, Vexhai stared at them in disbelief. "Adrenaline compound," Quindar reported. "The humans appear to have released some kind of stimulant gas that increases their physical performance and reduces their sensitivity to pain. They're drugging themselves?" "It appears so, Commander. They've deliberately impaired their judgment and increased their aggression in order to fight more effectively." Vexhai had heard of some warrior cultures that used combat stimulants, but those were usually administered before battle, in controlled doses, by trained medical personnel. The humans had apparently decided to flood their own ship with combat drugs while they were already engaged in a life-or-death struggle. The boarding actions continued for another hour, but it was clear that something fundamental had changed. The Zephyrian soldiers, despite their superior training and equipment, were struggling against opponents who seemed to operate according to completely different rules. Rules that included deliberately sabotaging their own life support, fighting effectively in hard vacuum, and using their own ship as a source of improvised weapons. When the final reports came in, Vexhai had to read them twice to believe them. Of the 4 human ships that had been boarded, 3 had been completely destroyed. But not by Zephyrian weapons. The humans had destroyed them themselves, detonating their own reactors once it became clear that their ships would be captured. The 4th ship had been taken, but only after the human crew had managed to delete all computer systems and destroy every piece of equipment that might be useful to their captors. The Zephyrian casualties from the boarding actions were higher than they had been in any similar operation in recent memory. Not because the humans had superior weapons or technology, but because they had been willing to turn their own environment into a weapon and fight under conditions that no rational species would consider survivable. "Admiral," Vexhai opened a channel to the fleet commander. "I'm beginning to think we need to reconsider our tactical approach to these humans." "Agreed, Commander. Signal all ships to maintain distance and engage with long-range weapons only. No more boarding actions." But as Vexhai looked at the tactical display showing the remaining human ships still maneuvering through the asteroid field, still fighting despite impossible odds, he couldn't shake the feeling that keeping their distance might not be enough. The humans had already demonstrated that they could turn disadvantages into advantages and use their own destruction as a weapon. The question was, what else were they capable of? By the 6th hour of battle, Vexhai was receiving reports that should have been impossible. "Commander?" Medical Officer Zenkara's voice carried a note of concern that Vexhai had never heard before. "I'm getting requests for psychological support from 17 different ships. Crew members are reporting stress reactions, combat fatigue, and in some cases, requests to be removed from active duty." Vexhai turned from the tactical display to stare at the medical officer. Zephyrians were trained from childhood to handle combat stress. Their military education included extensive psychological conditioning, meditation techniques, and chemical treatments to maintain mental stability during warfare. In 40 years of military service, Vex High had never heard of widespread psychological casualties in a single battle. What are they reporting exactly? Various symptoms, Commander. Difficulty sleeping, loss of appetite, recurring dreams about the human ships. But the most common report is fear of engaging the human vessels directly. Fear. Zephyrian soldiers experiencing fear of an inferior enemy. Vex High requested a direct link to Captain Hexval of the Destroyer Times, Righteous Fury *, one of the ships that had been engaged with human vessels for the longest period. Captain Hexval, this is Commander Vex High. I'm receiving reports of morale problems throughout the fleet. Can you explain what's happening out there? There was a long pause before the captain responded. Commander, have you actually watched the humans fight? I mean, really watched them? I've been monitoring the tactical situation continuously. That's not what I mean, Commander. Have you watched individual human soldiers? Have you seen what they do when their ships are damaged? When their friends are killed? When they're facing certain death? Vex High was about to respond when Captain Hexval continued. I watched a human ship lose atmospheric containment 3 hours ago. Half their crew was sucked out into space. The remaining crew could have used escape pods, could have surrendered, could have called for rescue. Instead, they manually aimed their crippled ship at one of our cruisers and rode it all the way to impact. They were singing, Commander. My sensors picked up their communications. They were singing songs as they flew their ship into our vessel. They were probably in shock from oxygen deprivation. No, Commander. Our medical scans showed normal brain activity right up until impact. They weren't delirious or confused. They were celebrating. Vex High felt something cold settle in his stomach. He activated his personal access to the battle recordings and began reviewing the footage from various ship encounters. What he saw defied every principle of military psychology he had ever learned. In normal warfare, there were predictable patterns. When a ship was badly damaged, the crew would attempt repairs. When repairs failed, they would try to retreat. When retreat was impossible, they would surrender. When surrender was refused, they might fight desperately, but with the clear desperation of creatures facing their own extinction. The humans didn't follow any of these patterns. When their ships were damaged, they used the damage as a tactical advantage. When they couldn't retreat, they didn't try to. When facing certain death, they seemed to become more dangerous, not less. In the footage, Vex High could see human crew members working frantically to repair their weapons while their ship was breaking apart around them, not to save themselves, but to get off one more shot at the enemy. Commander, Quindar called from her station. I'm reading something strange in the communications intercepts from the human ships. What kind of strange? Well, we've been monitoring their internal communications, trying to understand their battle coordination. Most of it is in their incomprehensible language. But our computers have been working on translation patterns. The main display showed a series of communication transcripts, with computer-generated translations appearing alongside the original audio. Vex High began reading through them, expecting to find the usual wartime chatter. Tactical reports, damage assessments, calls for assistance. Instead, he found something that made no sense at all. Hull breach, on Deck 7. Switching to emergency repairs. Copy that. Jenkins, you still with us? Jenkins got spaced, but he took out their sensor array before he went. Good job, Jenkins. Reactor's going critical. We've got maybe 10 minutes. Perfect. That's enough time to ram the big one. Everyone ready? Ready. It's been an honor, people. Vex High read through dozens of similar exchanges. Humans discussing their own impending deaths, with the same casual tone that most species use to discuss weather conditions. Humans celebrating the deaths of their companions as tactical victories. Humans making jokes while their ships were exploding around them. Commander, communications. Officer Yelthara interrupted his reading. We're receiving a transmission from Admiral Thex Moore. He's requesting immediate consultation. The Admiral appeared on the communication screen, and Vex's High was shocked by what he saw. Admiral Thex Moore, veteran of dozens of campaigns, decorated hero of the Zephyrian Empire, looked exhausted and strained. Commander, how many human ships are left? Vex High checked the tactical display. 7 vessels, Admiral. All showing various degrees of damage. 7 ships. We started this engagement with over 40 human contacts. We've destroyed 33 of their vessels. And we've lost 12 of our own ships, with damage to at least 20 more. Do you understand what that means? Vex High did the calculations in his head. The humans had achieved a kill ratio that should have been impossible with their primitive technology. But that wasn't the worst part. Admiral, are you suggesting we withdraw? Commander, I've been in contact with Fleet Command. They've been reviewing our battle recordings and consulting the galactic databases. They've found references to previous encounters with humans. Other encounters? When? Why weren't we informed? Because, until now, Command assumed they were isolated incidents, pirate attacks, border skirmishes, minor conflicts that lasted only a few hours. But the pattern is always the same. Admiral Thex Moore transmitted a series of files to Vex High's command station. Battle reports from different sectors, different time periods, different species. All describing encounters with small groups of human vessels. All describing the same impossible tactical results. The Korthak hegemony lost an entire battle group to 6 human ships 2 years ago. The Valerian Trade Federation reported losing a space station to a single human vessel that had been damaged beyond any hope of survival. In every case, the humans achieved tactical objectives that should have been impossible given their numbers and technology. Vex High scanned through the reports, looking for some kind of pattern or explanation. What do the xenopsychology experts say about human behavior? That's the problem, Commander. We don't have any real xenopsychology reports on humans. Most species that encounter them don't want to study them afterward. They just want them gone. But why? Because they're terrifying, Commander. Not because of their weapons or their technology, but because of what they represent. They're a species that doesn't understand the concept of acceptable losses. They don't have the psychological mechanisms that tell them when a fight is hopeless. They don't break. Vex High looked back at the tactical display showing the 7 remaining human ships. They were still maneuvering, still fighting, still somehow holding their own against overwhelming odds. As he watched, one of them managed to disable another Zephyrian cruiser using what appeared to be improvised weapons and sheer determination. Admiral, what are your orders? We're going to finish this engagement, Commander. But after this, I'm recommending that High Command classify humans as a Class 5 threat. Class 5. The highest threat rating in the Galactic Military Classification System, reserved for species that posed existential threats to galactic civilization. The same rating given to the ancient machines that had nearly wiped out all organic life thousands of years ago. As Vex High signed off with Admiral Thex Moore, he realized that they weren't just fighting a battle anymore. They were fighting for the psychological health of every crew member in the fleet, because somewhere in the back of his mind, a terrible question was forming. If these humans were this dangerous when they were outnumbered and outgunned, what would they be capable of when they had numbers and proper equipment? The battle was over. Of the 12 human ships that had entered the engagement, only one remained. It was heavily damaged, leaking atmosphere from multiple hull breaches, and showing energy readings that suggested imminent reactor failure. The Zephyrian First Fleet had achieved a tactical victory, but at a cost that would be remembered throughout the Empire for generations to come. 15 Zephyrian ships destroyed. 28 ships requiring major repairs, over 3,000 casualties, all to defeat 12 primitive vessels crewed by a species that had only achieved spaceflight within the last few decades. Vex High sat alone in his quarters, staring at a data terminal displaying the final casualty reports. The numbers didn't make sense. They violated every principle of military strategy and tactical mathematics. An inferior force should not have been able to inflict such damage on a superior enemy, regardless of how cleverly they fought or how willing they were to sacrifice themselves. There had to be an explanation, something that would make sense of what he had witnessed. He accessed the galactic database and began searching for information about humans and their homeworld. The initial files were sparse. Intelligence reports from trading posts, diplomatic notes from first contact procedures, basic biological and technological assessments. All of it painted the same picture of a young species with primitive technology and limited interstellar experience. But as Vex High dug deeper into the classified archives, using his command-level security clearance, he began to find references to older files. Files that had been buried in security classifications so deep that most military officers would never see them. The first thing he found was a xenobiology report filed by the Galactic Science Consortium 3 years ago. It was marked with warning indicators and classified at Level 7. Access restricted to senior military and government officials only. Vex High opened the file and began to read. Subject species: Homo sapiens. Human. Homeworld: Earth. Designation: Terra. 3. Classification: Class 12. Death World. Class 12 Death World. Vex High had to read that line several times before it sank in. The Galactic Classification System rated habitable worlds from Class 1 Paradise worlds, with minimal threats to life, to Class 1-5 worlds so hostile that no known species could survive there without extensive calibration, technological support. Most intelligent species evolved on Class 4 or Class 5 worlds. The Zephyrian homeworld was a comfortable Class 3. No species had ever been known to evolve naturally on anything above a Class 8 world. Environmental characteristics of Terra 3, Vex High read aloud, include, but are not limited to, extreme weather variations ranging from sub-zero to above boiling temperatures, regular seismic activity, active volcanic systems, toxic atmospheric components, predatory ecosystems with no safe ecological niches, gravity approximately 20% above galactic standard, atmospheric pressure fluctuations, regular bombardment by cosmic radiation, and magnetic field variations that interfere with most navigation systems. The report continued for pages, describing an environment that sounded more like a military testing ground than a place where life could evolve naturally. But the most disturbing part wasn't the description of Earth's environment, it was the conclusion. Humans appear to have evolved not in spite of these conditions, but because of them. Environmental pressure analysis suggests that human psychology, physiology, and social structures are specifically adapted for survival in conditions that would be considered catastrophic emergency situations by most galactic species. Vex High leaned back in his chair, trying to process what he was reading. The humans hadn't developed spaceflight to explore the galaxy or to escape their world's limitations. They had developed it because their entire evolutionary history had been spent learning to survive in environments that would kill most other species within hours. He accessed another file, this one marked as a psychological assessment, filed by the Galactic Council's Department of Interspecies Relations. Human behavior patterns suggest a species-wide adaptation to constant catastrophic stress. Humans appear to function normally under conditions that would cause psychological breakdown in most known species. This may explain their apparent indifference to personal safety and their tendency to treat survival-level emergencies as routine challenges. Furthermore, human social structures appear to be built around the assumption that any given individual may die at any moment due to environmental factors. This has resulted in a species-wide culture that values individual sacrifice for group survival and treats personal death as an acceptable cost for achieving objectives. Vex High found himself thinking about the human crew members he had watched during the battle, the way they had celebrated their companions' deaths as tactical victories, the way they had sung songs while flying their ship into a Zephyrian cruiser. It wasn't courage in any sense that he could understand. It was something else entirely. He accessed one final file, this one buried so deep in the classified archives that he almost missed it. It was a diplomatic memo from the Galactic Council to all member species, dated only 6 months ago. Urgent notice. Recent intelligence suggests that human expansion into galactic space may pose a significant threat to interstellar stability. Humans appear to treat military conflict as a natural environmental condition rather than an aberration to be avoided. Their willingness to accept casualties and their adaptation to hostile environments makes them potentially dangerous opponents in any extended conflict. Recommendation: all member species should avoid military confrontation with human forces whenever possible. If conflict becomes unavoidable, overwhelming force should be applied immediately to prevent humans from adapting to combat conditions. The memo was signed by the High Council and marked for distribution to all military commands throughout the galaxy. But apparently, the warning hadn't reached the Zephyrian First Fleet in time. A communication alert chimed on Vexhi's terminal. It was a message from the surviving human ship, Zephyrian Forces. The transmission began in heavily accented but recognizable galactic standard. "This is Captain Sarah Chen, of the Earth vessel Time's Indomitable Asterisk. We are prepared to discuss terms." Terms. The humans wanted to negotiate. After losing 11 ships and most of their crew, after being defeated by overwhelming force, they still thought they were in a position to discuss terms. Vexhi opened a channel to Admiral Thexmore. "Admiral, the humans are requesting negotiations. Terms of surrender, I assume?" "Unknown, Admiral. Should I respond?" "Put them through to the fleet channel. Let's see what they have to say." Captain Chen's image appeared on the main screen. She was younger than Vexhi had expected, with the soft features and pale skin that marked humans as obviously non-threatening by galactic standards. But her eyes held something that Vexhi was beginning to recognize as distinctly human. A complete absence of the fear that any rational being should feel in her situation. "Admiral Thexmore," Captain Chen said, "I want to thank you for an excellent battle. My crew and I have learned a great deal from this engagement." Admiral Thexmore's mandibles clicked in confusion. "Captain, you realize that your forces have been defeated?" "Of course. We knew that would be the likely outcome from the beginning. But that wasn't really the point." "Then what was the point?" "Information, Admiral. We needed to know how Zephyrian ships and crews would respond to our tactical approaches. Now, we know." Vexhi felt something cold settle in his stomach. The humans hadn't been fighting to win the battle. They had been fighting to learn about their enemies. They had sacrificed 11 ships and hundreds of lives for intelligence gathering. "Captain Chen," Admiral Thexmore said carefully, "are you saying this entire engagement was a reconnaissance mission?" "Not exactly, Admiral. We were here to support our allies in the rebellion. But we're always learning. That's what humans do." "And what have you learned?" Captain Chen smiled, and Vexhi realized it was possibly the most terrifying expression he had ever seen on a sentient being's face. "We've learned that Zephyrian ships are vulnerable to electromagnetic pulse weapons. We've learned that your crews have difficulty adapting to unconventional tactics. We've learned that your boarding procedures assume rational behavior from defenders. And most importantly, we've learned that you're not as scary as everyone said you were." The communication ended, leaving the command bridge in absolute silence. 3 hours later, as Vexhi sat in his quarters writing his report for Fleet Command, he tried to find words to describe what had happened. But how could he explain that they had achieved a tactical victory that felt like a defeat? How could he make his superiors understand that the real threat wasn't human technology or numbers, but the simple fact that humans approached warfare like it was a learning experience? The final line of his report read, "Recommend immediate reclassification of humans as galactic-level threat. They are not just another species. They are what happens when evolution produces apex predators that treat extinction-level events as Tuesday morning." As he finished writing, Vexhi looked out the viewing port at the stars and wondered how many other human ships might be out there, gathering information, learning from their encounters with galactic civilization. The universe had just become a much more dangerous place.